we can go back to what Mark said in 2012 when he was taking Facebook public. And, this is the wake of the Arab Spring. I think people really have to remember what an extraordinary year 2011 was. It starts with the Arab Spring. Dictators are pulled down. Now, people say, Facebook took them down. I mean, of course, it was the citizens, the people themselves took down dictators, aided by Facebook and Twitter and I don't know if it was or texting. There were some other platforms they used. So the argument that Mark makes in this letter to potential shareholders, investors, is, we're at a turning point in history, and social media is rewiring. We're giving people the tools to rewire their institutions. So this all sounds great. Like, this is the democratic dream. And what I write about in the essay is the period of techno-democratic optimism, which began in the early 90s with the fall of the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. And then the internet comes in, and, people my age remember how extraordinary it was, how much fun it was. I mean, the sense that this was the dawning of a new age, and there was so much optimism. And so this optimism runs all the way from the early 90s, all the way through 2011. With the Arab Spring. And of course, that year ends with Occupy Wall Street. And there were also big protest movements in Israel and Spain and in a lot of areas. Martin Gurry talks about this. So there certainly was a case to be made that Facebook in particular, but all these platforms, these were God's gift to democracy. What dictator could possibly keep out the internet? What dictator could stand up to people connected on these digital media platforms? So that's the strong case that this is going to be good for democracy. And then we can see what happened in the years after. Now, first of all, so in Mark's response to you, so here, let me read from what he said when you interviewed him. He says, I think it's worth grounding this conversation in the actual research that has been done on this, which by and large finds that social media is not a large driver of polarization. He says that. Then he says, most academic studies that I've seen actually show that social media use is correlated with lower polarization. That's a factual claim that he makes, which is not true. But he asserts that it's tricky because he says the studies he has seen. So it might be that the studies he has seen say that. But if you go to the Google Doc with Chris Bale, you see there's 7 different questions that can be addressed. And on one of them, which is filter bubbles, the evidence is very mixed. And he might be right that Facebook overall doesn't contribute to filter bubbles. But on the other 6, the evidence is pretty strongly on the yes side. It is a cause.
And he also draws a line between the United States versus the rest of the world.
Right. And there's one thing true about that, which is that polarization has been rising much faster in the U.S. than in any other major country. So he's right about that. So we're talking about an article by Matthew Genskow and a few other researchers. It's a very important article. We've got it in the political dysfunction database.
And we should say that in this study, there's, like I started to say, there's a lot of fascinating questions that it's organized by whether studies indicate yes or no. Question 1 is, does social media make people more angry or effectively polarized? Question 2 is, does social media create echo chambers? These are fascinating, really important questions. Question 3 is, does social media amplify posts that are more emotional, inflammatory, or false? Question 4 is, does social media increase the probability of violence? Question 5 is, does social media enable foreign governments to increase political dysfunction in the U.S. and other democracies? Question 6, does social media decrease trust? 7 is, does social media strengthen populist movements? And then there's other sections, as you mentioned.
Yeah, that's right. But once you operationalize it as 7 different questions, so one is about polarization, and there are measures of that, the degree to which people say they hate the other side. And so in this study by Boxell, Genskow, and Shapiro, 2021, they looked at all the measures of polarization they could find going back to the 1970s for about 20 different countries. And they show plots. You have these nice plots with red lines showing that in some countries it's going up, like the United States especially. In some countries it's going down, and in some countries it's pretty flat. And so Mark says, well, if polarization's going up a lot in the US but not in most other countries, well, maybe Facebook isn't responsible. But so much depends on how you operationalize things. Are we interested in the straight line, regression line going back to the 70s? And if so, well, then he's right in what he says. But that's not the argument. The argument isn't that, it's been rising or falling since the 70s. The argument is it's been rising or falling since 2012 or so. And for that, now I've been emailing with the authors of this study, and they say there's not really enough data to do it statistically reliably because there's only a few observations after 2012. But if you look at the graphs in their study, and they actually do provide, as they pointed out to me, they do provide a statistical test if you break the data at the year 2000. So actually, polarization is going up pretty widely if you just look after 2000, which is when the internet would be influential. And if you look just after 2012, you have to just do it by eye. But if you do it on their graphs by eye, you see that actually a number of countries do see a sudden sharp upturn. Not all by any means. But my point is, Mark asserts, he points to one study, and he points to this over and over again. I have had 2 conversations with him. He pointed to this study both times. He asserts that this study shows that polarization is up some places, down other places. There's no association. But actually, we have another section in the Google Doc where we review all the data on the decline of democracy. And the high point of democracy, of course, it was rising in the 90s. But if you look around the world, by some measures, it begins to drop in the late 2000s, around 2007, 2008. By others, it's in the early to mid 2010s. The point is, by many measures, there's a drop in the quality and the number of democracies on this planet that began in the 2010s. And so, yes, Mark can point to one study, but if you look in the Google Doc, there are a lot of other studies that point the other way, and especially about whether things are getting more polarized or less, more polarized. Not in all countries, but in a lot.